The golden glow of the sunset bathed the small town in a deceptively tranquil light. The neatly aligned houses, pristine white fences, and cobblestone streets seemed like a picture-perfect scene too good to be true. But Kyle Carter knew better. Beneath the smooth facade were cracks, fractured pieces that no one wanted to acknowledge. The sound of an engine echoed from the end of the street, shattering the stillness. Standing on the front porch of his house, Kyle frowned as he spotted the bright red sports car slowly pulling into the driveway. The car came to a stop, and the girl who stepped out made it impossible for him to look away. Evelyn Monroe's long black hair cascaded down her angular face, framing her sharp features. Her crimson lips curved into a faint smirk. A challenge to the world itself. Her piercing gaze, cold and unyielding, seemed to cut right through the walls Kyle had so carefully built around him. She stood there, one hand resting on the car door, surveying the house like it was a place she barely recognized. In truth, she had lived here briefly before she left. But this time her return carried an entirely different energy. Without waiting for a welcome, Evelyn hauled her suitcase up the porch steps, walking past Kyle without so much as a glance in his direction. "Welcome home," Kyle muttered under his breath, his tone laced with sarcasm. Evelyn stopped and turned her head slightly and met his eyes. With her dark brown gaze held a flicker of something unreadable. "Who are you?" The house was eerily quiet, and Kyle lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. But his mind was elsewhere. A haunting melody drifted through the silence emanating from Evelyn's room. Was it her violin that she played? She asked flatly, her voice cold as if his existence was completely inconsequential. Kyle hesitated for a moment, startled by her question, and before he could gather the courage to respond, Evelyn turned and entered the house, leaving him standing on the porch, stunned and invisible. The door slammed shut behind her, the sharp sound reverberating like a warning that her return would not be peaceful. That night weren't just music. They were a declaration of a raw and defiant challenge to the world to hear her buried pain. The knell was unsettling, dark, and heavy, carrying an unspoken truth that seemed to weigh down the entire house. Kyle felt his chest tightens, his emotions swirling with something he couldn't quite name. Wasn't just curiosity. It was deeper, more powerful, magnetic pull toward the girl who had stormed into his life like a hurricane. The music stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on Kyle like an invisible weight. He sat up, his movements instinctive, his body seemingly pulled by an unseen force as he walked toward her door. On the other side of the door, Evelyn must have felt it too, that something had shifted, something dangerous had been set into motion. But did she realize that from the moment she stepped out of that car, she had unleashed a force neither of them could control or undo? Kyle couldn't stop thinking about Evelyn's days past after her return. Yet all he knew about her were fragmented pieces of a story told half-heartedly by his father and stepmother. But it was exactly that imperfection, that incompleteness, that made her an obsession in his mind. A half-finished portrait full of mystery. Every time he heard the sound of her footsteps in the hallway or caught a fleeting glimpse of her disappearing into a room, Kyle felt as though he were being drawn toward an abyss. He couldn't resist. One afternoon, with the house unusually quiet, his father and stepmother both out, Kyle found himself wandering down the hallway. He stopped outside Evelyn's door, which was slightly ajar. He heard her voice, low but sharp like a blade cutting through the still air. He hesitated about walking away, but her next words rooted him to the spot. "He left my mom and me when I was a child, and now he wants to return." "No, I don't need him," Evelyn exclaimed over the phone, her voice shaking, but not with anger but with sadness. For what purpose? That night, when they sat across from each other at the dinner table with the rest of the family, Evelyn wore her usual mask of cold indifference. But Kyle, armed with the knowledge of what she was carrying, felt an odd, inexplicable ache that seemed to mirror her own. Kyle realized she was lying again about her father, and the sarcasm and bitterness in her tone carried a weight that revealed wounds she had well hidden. He didn't listen further, moving away quietly. The next day, Kyle found her at the lake behind the town, where she sat on the wooden dock with her violin resting on her lap and her eyes far away as they gazed out over the still water. He was unsure whether to approach, but Evelyn seemed to sense his presence before he made a sound. "Are you here to listen to me?" He wanted to ask her about what he had overheard, but she gave him no chance. Instead, He chose to watch her silently, hoping to get a glimpse of the person hidden behind her arrogant and impenetrable exterior. "I'm not here for any reason," Kyle said, finally, his voice unsure. "I just saw you here." Evelyn gave a short, sharp laugh that had more meaning than he could understand. "Complain?" she asked, her voice tinged with her familiar sarcasm. "Or are you just looking for something to kill time?" Kyle asked, stopping a few steps away. "Do you turn to him then?" Her black eyes penetrating yet tinged with a melancholy he couldn't entirely understand. "I bet you think I'm a terrible person too," she murmured in a sweet yet scathing tone. After a lengthy silence, Evelyn raised the violin to her shoulder and played a few soft notes that hung in the air like whispers. "You don't know Kyle," she said in a light, almost wistful voice. "No," Kyle said honestly. "I just think you're hiding something. I don't know what it is. But I don't think you're the person you want people to believe you. What do you see? It is only the surface beneath it. Sometimes even I don't know who I am." In that moment, Kyle realized Evelyn wasn't just the enigmatic girl he had imagined her to be. She was someone trying desperately to escape old wounds, someone so ensnared by her past that she couldn't bring herself to trust anyone else. And from that moment on, Kyle knew she wasn't just part of his life, she was the place where he would lose himself entirely if he wasn't careful. But Kyle didn't feel afraid. He only felt that somehow he needed to break through the walls she had built around herself, even if doing so would send them both plunging into the depths of an abyss. They couldn't climb out of that evening. The town was draped in a thin veil of rain-light winds, swept through the empty streets carrying the damp chill and the earthy scent of wet soil. Inside the silent house, the faint glow from the kitchen lamp cast soft shadows on the walls. Kyle sat at the dining table, absently sketching in his notebook, hoping to quiet the storm in his mind. But no matter how hard he tried, his thoughts kept circling back to Evelyn, vivid, as if she was standing right before him. The sound of footsteps descending the stairs broke through the stillness. Kyle looked up to see Evelyn dressed in an oversized sweater and fitted jeans, her hair cascading like rippling waves. For a fleeting moment their eyes met, and Kyle noticed something different. Evelyn didn't carry her usual air of indifference. Instead, her eyes held a sadness, a silent plea she couldn't put into words. "Can't sleep?" Evelyn asked softly, her voice cutting through the quiet. She walked into the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water, but for once she didn't turn her back on him. Instead, she leaned against the counter facing him, her gaze probing. "What about you? Sometimes I think sleep doesn't change anything. It's just a way to run away. But everything's still there waiting for you in the morning." Evelyn shrugged, setting her glass down on the counter. Kyle responded, trying to keep his tone steady, but the worry in his voice betrayed him. She sat across from Kyle, her eyes searching his face as if trying to unravel him. The air between them grew heavier, charged with a tension that neither of them could ignore, as if they were both on the verge of something irrevocable. "Do you ever feel stuck?" Ever so abruptly, she asked her voice low, her eyes dark and endless. "Trapped between what you want and what you're supposed to do?" Her question struck Kyle like a blade slicing through his thoughts. He nodded constantly, and Evelyn gave a small laugh. But it was devoid of joy. It carried only bitterness and resignation. "Well, at least we have that in common." The silence that followed wasn't consoling. It was full of unspoken emotions, and every second stretched the invisible string between them. Kyle couldn't take his eyes away from Evelyn, and he could feel the same pull emanating from her magnetic force, drawing them together, impossible to resist. "You don't have to be strong all the time," Kyle said suddenly, his voice low but earnest, surprising even himself. She leaned forward a little and whispered in a voice that was steady but trembling, like a secret she was daring to share. "What if I told you I don't want to run anymore?" Evelyn stared at him, her eyes flickering with an emotion he couldn't name. Her breath was as soft as the rain outside, but it made the space between them feel impossible and suffocating to Kyle. "Think I'm selfish?" Kyle didn't answer. He didn't need to in that instant as Evelyn leaned closer, and her gaze locked onto. He knew they had already crossed every line. There was no more right or wrong, only the undeniable truth. He couldn't resist her. Evelyn moved closer to her, lips hovering inches from his. Kyle could feel her warmth, her breath mingling with his, and his heart pounded so fiercely it threatened to break free from his chest, then like a storm breaking without warning. Evelyn kissed him. Their first kiss was anything but gentle. It was raw, urgent, and filled with the intensity of emotions that had been repressed for far too long. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a release, a rebellion against everything that had held them back. And yet it was also the beginning of something neither of them could control. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. Evelyn's eyes were wide, filled with uncertainty and vulnerability. "We shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice trembling. But there was no conviction in her words. Kyle said nothing he didn't need. He knew from that moment on everything had irrevocably changed. Evelyn stood, taking a step back as if to create distance. But before leaving, she turned to look at him one last time. Her gaze was a mix of pain and longing, and in it Kyle saw the same turmoil he felt within himself. Then she disappeared into the shadows of the hallway, leaving Kyle alone in the dimly lit kitchen. He sat there, his mind spinning with 1,000 questions and one undeniable truth: he had crossed a boundary he never thought he would. And there was no going back. The house was steeped in tension no one dared to name. Since that night, everything between Kyle and Evelyn had shifted. They avoided each other's eyes when others were around, yet they were irresistibly drawn to one another like opposite poles of a magnet. In the stolen moments they shared alone, each fleeting touch, each furtive glance felt like smoldering embers ready to ignite into flames. But both Kyle and Evelyn knew this could not last forever. And then, inevitably, the fire erupted, consuming everything in its path. That afternoon, Leo showed up at Kyle's house. His usual easy smile was in place, but his eyes carried a sharpness, a weariness that made Kyle uneasy. Evelyn had just stepped out of the kitchen. When she saw him, the air in the room immediately grew heavy. Both Kyle and Evelyn sensed something was off, but Leo only offered casual greetings, his voice smooth and deceptively light. Later that evening, after Kyle's father and Evelyn's mother left for a dinner party, it was just the three of them. Leo suggested they go to the lake for some beers and relaxation. Kyle wanted to decline, but the look in Leo's eyes left him with little choice. They arrived at the lake as the sun dipped below the horizon, the darkness spreading like a curtain ready to reveal truths long hidden. Leo leaned against a tree, a beer can in his hand, his gaze fixed intently on every movement between Kyle and Evelyn. They exchanged small talk at first, but the tension simmered just below the surface. Then, without warning, Leo let out a humorous chuckle and turned his sharp gaze toward Evelyn. "You always had a habit of disappearing, didn't you, Evelyn?" When he said, "I don't think there's any need to bring up the past," Evelyn froze, her body tense, her eyes cold but showing a flicker of fear. "I don't think there's any need to bring up the past," she replied, her voice calm but guarded. "But it seems like you haven't really changed, have you? Always?" Leo pushed off the tree, his smile turning into an unreadable smile. "Do you even know who she is?" His eyes shifted to Kyle, and the smile completely disappeared as he pulled others into your mayhem and then left them as everything fell apart. "Leo, Kyle, are you aware of what she did?" Kyle interrupted, his tone stern. But Leo wasn't done. "No, Kyle, I think you need to hear this," he said, taking a step closer. "Do you really think she cares?" Kyle said, "I know more than anyone, and I'm not going to let him get sucked into your mess the way I did." In that moment, it all made sense to Kyle, the shattered pieces of Evelyn's past, the simmering jealousy in Leo, and she moved between them, her eyes blazing with rage. "Stop it, Leo. You don't know anything. Don't know anything." Leo laughed harshly, echoing a harsh sound through the quiet night. With sadness and confusion in his gaze, he turned to face Evelyn. "Is it, Evelyn?" It's true that Evelyn paused, staring at him as he searched for words that would not come. "Come, Kyle." Evelyn. Leo intervened. "Don't waste your breath." It seemed like the ground beneath Kyle's feet was buckling. "He's not like us. He doesn't realize that people like us only ruin everything we touch." Evelyn grabbed his hand and held him back as he turned away. "Kyle, please don't go. Don't let him ruin what we have." Kyle looked at her, his eyes full of pain. "Evelyn, I don't know if I can believe anything anymore, but I know I can't keep doing this." Leo took a step back, a moment of regret flashing across his face, but his voice stayed icy. "He's right, Evelyn. We both know this was never going to end well. Evelyn's hand fell from Kyle's, and for the first time, tears slid down her face. I never meant to hurt anyone. But maybe you're right. Maybe all I do is ruin everything, Kyle said. Nothing more. He walked away, leaving Evelyn standing there alone with the darkness and the painful truth she could no longer avoid, and in that moment the fragile bond between them seemed to snap. Leaving all three of them to face the irrevocable consequences of their choices, the house had never felt colder. Everything now seemed to be nothing more than an endless. Evelyn had left the next morning without a single word of explanation or farewell. She vanished the way she always did, quietly, yet leaving behind wounds so deep they could never truly. He stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the gray sky, but in his mind there was only her. The pain in her eyes, her final plea, and the way her hand had slipped from him the night before. Days turned into weeks, yet time did little to dull the ache. Kyle grew quieter, retreating into a world of his own where every thought and emotion revolved around Evelyn. He couldn't stop thinking about her, couldn't stop wondering if she ever thought of him. The house, once bustling with life, now echoed with an eerie stillness. Though his father never voiced his concerns, Kyle could see the worry in his eyes. Sandra, his stepmother, remained as silent as ever, behaving as though nothing had happened, as though the rupture in their lives was something too delicate to acknowledge. One day, Kyle wandered into his room and saw his old sketchbook lying on the desk, its cover coated in a fine layer of dust. He picked it up and flipped through its pages, only to find it as filled with unfinished sketches of Evelyn. Her piercing gaze, her fleeting smile, and the moment she sat by the lake, violin in hand. He had tried to capture everything about her. Yet the more he looked, the deeper the pain cut into him. Overwhelmed by emotions he could no longer contain, Kyle sat down with a pencil in hand for the first time in months. But this time he wasn't simply sketching Evelyn. He poured every ounce of his grief, his inner conflict, and the love he knew he would never reclaim into the drawing. He drew the lake where they had stood together, the moonlight reflecting on the water, and Evelyn's figure walking away, leaving behind an empty, aching void. As time passed, that piece became the most complete and profound work Kyle had ever created. No one knew what drove him to organize a small art exhibit in town. But those who attended agreed on one thing: the painting titled Farewell Under the Moonlight was the centerpiece. Both beautiful and heartbreakingly sad, it captured a sense of loss so deeply that anyone who looked at it felt the weight of Kyle's pain. On the day of the exhibit, Kyle stood in a quiet corner of the gallery, watching as visitors paused in front of the painting. They whispered, they admired, and some even shed tears, but none of their words mattered to Kyle. All he cared about was the faint, fleeting hope that the person he had painted would appear. And then she did. Amid the crowd, Kyle saw her. Evelyn stood a few steps away from the painting, her eyes fixed on it, as if she was seeing not just the image, but the raw emotions he had etched into every line and shadow. She didn't move or speak, but her presence made everything else around him fade away. Kyle's breath caught in his throat, his grip on the wine glass tightening as his heart pounded wildly. Then, as quietly as she had entered his life, Evelyn turned and melted into the crowd, leaving no trace behind. Kyle, he hurried to the door in a desperate attempt to get a last glimpse of her. But when he stepped outside, the street was deserted. She was gone. Evelyn finally turned their eyes and met him across the room. They met in that moment without the need for words. Under the gentle glow of the gallery lights, Kyle allowed himself a small smile, a sad yet peaceful one, knowing that somewhere out there, Evelyn was smiling too, carrying a part of him with her, just as he would forever hold her image in his heart. He had stood there for a moment, letting the cool night air wash over him slowly. Then he went back to the gallery and stopped in front of the painting, closing his eyes. Perhaps this was how it was meant to end. Perhaps loving someone didn't always mean holding on to them.